This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
Right? Because I do think that there are universalizable aspects of how trauma impacts the human mind, body, and spirit. And there are also different healing methods and solutions and policy implications that will work in different communities and for different people.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and today we have part 3 of the 3-part series, Unveiling Trauma's Hidden Costs, from the webinar that we did in May with our guests, Martin Sims, founder of the Dope Coach Academy, Ingrid Cochran, CEO of Cochran Consulting, Connie Iannetta, founder of Foster Strong, and Jesse Kohler, Executive Director on Loan for the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. In this episode, we talk about how to address the costs of trauma. We talk about what are some of the concerns about the way we talk about trauma, and how can we make sure that we are doing what we need to do to be addressing trauma at its source so that we can have a healthier society. If we're talking in a language that is medical, for example, and that's not something that speaks to someone, or they have had trauma in the medical system, so that is actually kind of pushing them away, I think that's a really important point. So thank you for sharing that. Ingrid, would you like to add?
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off what you were saying, Manya. This communication piece is big, and it's probably one of the most frustrating elements of the work that I've been doing for the past 5 years is the different forces that are at play when we talk about how we communicate with each other and what's needed. And I definitely appreciate what Martin is saying about talking in a way that, meets people where they are. And this is one of, I guess, if I had a critique of the trauma-informed movement, it is that issue, how we need to ensure that we are talking in a way that we meet people where they are. So much of this work has been so heavily academic and it's hard to translate. And people, even though I am very interested in the brain, but if we have this very clear neuroscientific discussion, how does that translate to the masses? Does it translate to the masses? It doesn't. And I appreciate you, Martin, making the distinction around dumbing things down versus meeting people where they are. It's very important. And so that we need to make sure that we are communicating in a way on both ends, that we're able to meet people where they are, but also that we create the space that someone who is not as, I don't want to use the word articulate, but can jump into the conversation without having perfect language. That's important as well. So the way that we use communication and language as a tool of exclusion is really what I'm getting to here.
Absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that as well. And Jesse, this kind of leads us into a question I had for you, because we're talking about communication. What are some other ways we can foster a greater awareness or understanding about this cost of trauma and the steps that we're taking to reduce those costs?
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything as groundbreaking as what Martin and Ingrid were sharing for sure. But I will say that that's kind of why we're trying to build a grassroots advocacy movement to promote diverse community contexts and lived experiences, being able to share why this is important to them in different ways, right? Because I do think that there are universalizable aspects of how trauma impacts the human mind, body, and spirit. And there are also different healing methods and solutions and policy implications that will work in different communities and for different people. And with kind of the, I'll say like the roots of the trauma-informed movement being very academic, very white. We've got like policies that kind of promote these quote unquote evidence-based practices. And that's really a function of where money has gone, where research has gone, and it's not culturally competent for sure. And it's also not effective for everyone. Like I can tell you to what Martin was saying, like the best thing for me was sports. I was a college baseball player, and having a coach who brought me in when I wasn't able to sleep because of recurring nightmares and told me that he was just going to lift with me. And I was like, all right, I'll come in before school because I'm up anyway. That built more transformational resilience in my own life than the therapy and medications that I also took. Like, I think that having that diverse element of bringing different people's stories together and connecting on that, to Kyla's point in the chat there, bringing conversations like advocacy at a policy level, yes, because we need to fix and address systemic trauma that exists, that silos and fragments our systems, that perpetuate stress and adversity disproportionately on marginalized and oppressed communities, that create predictable outcomes at an individual, family, and community level, that then have the implications on the systems that we were talking about in the first part of this call. But bringing in a bunch of different voices and recognizing, creating those conditions of empowerment, we hope, to have constituent voice hold like power and elected officials and other key partners that need to be part of this work accountable to their responsibility to all of us as the individuals that they are supposed to care about, and really working to build new policy solutions, be innovative in our approaches to really address the root cause of the problems that are creating so much dysfunction throughout our society and our systems is really, really important. And so again, like Martin and Ingrid were saying, way more powerful work that I think is the more that we can uplift voices of lived experience like that, the more that we can break down the barriers that currently may exist in terms of language and communication are so important. And I'll just throw in the advocacy series that we've developed at CTIP and the community advocacy network that we're building, which all of our stuff is free. And we're trying to promote equitable voice to hold policymakers accountable, to create new policy solutions. And I think that that is a huge part, that everybody's voice and the experiences that we hold, and I see this as part of that post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic wisdom, being able to use our stories to help create better looking systems, giving ourselves or others the help we wish we had gotten, as well as uplifting where systems did things right and investing more in those areas will help us get to a world that fundamentally looks different than the one that we look in today.
Thank you, Jesse. And I appreciate you mentioning, uplifting where it is being done right these days too, because it is in places. It's not all doom and gloom. So we want to support those folks who are getting it right. And Connie, I'd love to ask you a question to follow this up. I mean, what kind of promising practices or approaches have you seen that have shown really positive results in addressing these costs of trauma?
Well, hands down, peer support and advocacy. The two have gone hand in hand as far as my own path. But I think in building awareness and that sense of community, not only the shared language is important, but being amongst people with a shared culture, whether it be shared culture of foster care, mental health history. For me, I've been in all of the spaces of child serving systems. So mental health, foster care, juvenile justice, and then some. So I found that myself and others, we not only found our community, but we found healing and purpose. So, I mean, purpose was a key driving force for all of us in our path to healing. So, and a lot of us, we came together in the early days of the Youth Advisory Board in Pennsylvania. So a lot of us who had experience in child serving systems, we were early youth advocates, the original YAB, actually. We were the founding members of the Pennsylvania Youth Advisory Board. And as we aged out, we realized, you don't age out of trauma, but we aged out of all these youth groups and we aged out of these systems. So we were like, trying to find a place. And then it evolved to participating in, there was My Life, there was Systems of Care. We founded the Youth Move, Pennsylvania, the Philly chapter, all those things. So, and then eventually we evolved into Foster Strong and other groups and affiliations and boards. And we realized we don't always have to be invited to the table. Sometimes we can create our own table, and we did. So, we empower each other and uplift each other. So, but a lot of us, we had roles that were the peer support specialists, the this, the that, the youth navigators and things of that nature. And I think fusing that lived experience into all of these systems, it's very beneficial, culturally and purposefully and everything like that. So for me, I've always been a supporter of peer support and advocacy. And, if you can raise enough awareness and empower enough voices and take that to, state advocacy and legislatures and then the national level. I mean, I was a kid who was homeless at 18, and then I ended up at the White House speaking on things and issues and stuff. I could have never foreseen that happening. So, I mean, I always tell people, like, the biggest thing you can grasp onto when you've been through trauma is hope. So empowering people to use their voice and give them the awareness of the issues and how to navigate the systems is really crucial in that as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. Martin, same question to you. Promising practices or approaches you've seen.
Well, I alluded to it earlier, and I'm still on it. Like, I'm a huge advocate of sports and exercise, just because people can own that in their own households, in their own space. If they want to go to a community, like, they can do that. There's a lot of community involved with that. I got a friend of mine. I guess he's a friend, but I met her through the neurosequential model. But she just wrote a book called 57 Fridays. Myra Sachs, she lost her toddler or a 2-year-old to a disease, and they created this group called Emotion, and they just run it out, right? So there's this community group, a running community group, where they talk about losing their children or their loved ones, and they help each other grieve through those moments, the very difficult ones. But there's a lot that goes into the movement sports. So Jesse alluded to it earlier, being in baseball. Well, you got the pattern, repetitive, rhythmic movement that goes on. You got the routine. You got the structure. You got a lot of things that's involved in sports that provide the environments and the therapeutic environments needed for building resilience and healing and things of that nature. And so then you have, in the work that he does now, after going through all the things and then going through the sports environment and then knowing for himself that these things helped him, and these are the barriers that were in the way. I have the same thing, not the exact same story, but I mean, it was something very similar. Like, someone died of a heart attack in my face while we was playing basketball when I was in the 9th grade. I couldn't be a student after that experience in the way that I was supposed to be a student. So I went to 4 different high schools and eventually dropped out. That wasn't because I wasn't able to do the information that they was providing me. In my capacity, I didn't have it, and I didn't know that I didn't have it, and no one around me didn't know that I didn't. They had no idea. So there's nobody to even go back to blame. Like, my mom wasn't there. She didn't know. Like, nobody knew what to do with something like this. And so, like he said, they started giving them medications. And so it's uninformed. It's like, even if they're wanting to help, they're not really truly helping because it's uninformed. So I think the awareness of it. So we could take places that these kids are already in because their parents are the ones who had the ACEs. We're not even counting the kids and what they're going through right now. And so when I look at a basketball team, it could be between 10 and 12 players. We'll say 10 for instance. If the ACEs things are true, 6 of my players have gone through something before the age of 18. If the ACEs are true, then 5 of those have gone through more than one thing. So half of my team has dealt with trauma. Now we gotta look at their parents. What's going on with their parents? So as a coach, you should be trauma informed just to deal with half of your team. You know what I'm saying? So, like, then we have to create things that can teach coaches who are maybe volunteer coaches or just get some type of stipend, because this isn't like it's not like we look at youth coaches like it's a super profession. It's like what you do when you get off of work, right? And so then that's a whole day of stressors. And then you got to deal with somebody else kid who got an attitude, and you could blow up, and that could trigger you, and that could turn into a thing in that space. So coaches need to be trauma informed. Administrators need to be trauma informed. Teachers, everybody that deals with everybody who's been through these things needs to at least be able to resolve their own, because that puts you it lowers the power differential when you can say, hey, look, I've been through some things myself that caused me to do things that I didn't necessarily agree with, or put me in a situation that I wasn't really aware of how I would respond. So I do understand where you're coming from, and here's how it would help me and how I can help you, because that's what works for me. Because I've been there. I dropped out of school. I couldn't manage the process of getting all the way through graduation after seeing what I saw. And that ain't even something that happened to me. That was the secondary trauma. It don't even show up on the ACEs questions. I have 4 or 5 other ACEs that I can check off, but this particular incident doesn't even show up on that chart. So it's like, okay, when I get all of this information, and then I'm able to process it through myself, my son has a different outcome. My players that I coach now have a different outcome, because I'm not looking at them like they got an attitude with me. I can actually look at that behavior like, hey, look, that is something that probably far deeper than what interaction him and I just had. And let's try to unpack that. But if I don't have that awareness, if I don't have that, I could literally just misinterpret a behavior or misinterpret an interaction as something that's more personal than it could be. And then now you get into a space where you could be helpful, but you cause more harm. And so what we would like to do is just, in these sports spaces, in the exercise spaces, see what you have at your disposal about helping people move their bodies in a rhythmic way. And then you can also impart a lot of knowledge and wisdom that you learn through processes of dealing with your own trauma first. And I think that's the best way to go about it, because it acknowledges the people who are dealing with the people who are going through things, but it acknowledges them and what they've been through as well. And then I think that's the best way to have it and keep it as parallel as possible while we try to grow in each generation or each level or hierarchical process. Everybody is moving upwards versus like this crunching or shit rolls downhill type deal.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. And Jesse, same question to you. What are some promising practices or approaches that you've seen showing some positive results?
I mean, definitely everything that's been said, right? I think that to Martin's point, it's the code. Everybody who deals with a child needs to be trauma informed. Like, I think that one of the things that we're starting to see is that, like, there used to be this, like, there is deeply embedded within our systems. Like, I see it most in the education system / like school to prison pipeline. So a bit in the criminal legal system, but like, there's this eject reject model within our systems. And it's sort of like, it used to be dealing with someone's trauma was someone else's job. And when we're seeing it's actually like a full environmental shift, and it's everybody's responsibility and accountability to develop relationships with the child, not just the counselor, while the counselor may have specialized skills to come in certain instances, like that sort of full environment approach has been far better. And when there's buy-in from the top, than just like, we're just going to give the counselor some training and kind of, if someone starts acting up, we're just going to send them to the counselor. Because again, that kind of reinforces like, I'm alone in this. It's kind of that eject reject model that doesn't enforce relationships, which we know are healing happens in the context of healthy relationships over time. And so to embed those relationships where a child sees trust throughout an environment is so important. Any human, not just children. The other piece that is really huge, and this goes into something Connie was talking about, but like the power of cross-sector coalitions. Like, we could go down, or a couple of years ago, we did with others, including Paces Connection, a workshop series called Building the Movement that has like 36 hours of footage about like the ways that different sectors are embedding this work. And there's just so much to say. Even that didn't feel like enough, and also way too much at the same time. But there's the power of like not existing within the silos that we bring together, but kind of talking about all the systems and the way that we can function better within communities and across structures to come up with novel solutions is huge. And uplifting voice, like not just policymakers or other key decision makers deciding what's going to happen within a community or an organization, but creating conditions of empowerment, voice, and choice for people to come together and come up with complex solutions, and to have the sustainability where it's okay if we make a mistake. In innovating, we will not get it right the first time automatically, But to have that sustainability where if we make a step that didn't work the way that we expected, then we are able to layer in loop learning that allows for us to take the next step toward the direction that we're trying to go. And I referenced the work of the Family Policy Council in Washington State, now known as Self-Healing Communities. That's big because there was a lot of evidence built out of the 17 years of the work. There are other places that this work has been done, but the social and economic benefits of uplifting communities, giving them the power to decide for themselves, like giving them education and supporting a common language and understanding about how trauma impacts the human mind, body, and spirit, as well as some regulation activities and exercises to be able to really engage through difficult and uncomfortable conversations and stay in those conversations long enough to move to where there was agreement and next steps had powerful benefits like across communities, right? In one community, we saw youth suicide and suicide attempts reduced by 98%. Juvenile justice system involvement fell by 50%. We saw birth to teen pregnant or birth to teen mothers fall substantially, which had massive consequences across a lifespan. We had and graduation rates increased. There were all of these benefits by addressing the root cause. And that wasn't because someone said, here's what you need to do, or we're only going to work in one sector. It was, we're going to support communities engaging in their own learning systems to figure out what is best for them and learn from one another as the 17 years went on. And the consequences, the benefits of that work were powerful. And so while we could speak to the trauma-informed work that is being done in a variety of different ways, also letting other people, to what Connie said, form their own tables, build their own tables, and figure out what they want to do and learn from that and have the power to make mistakes without fear of, I'm going to lose the grant and then we can't continue this work. But rather really have sustainability built into it is a hugely promising practice that I think policymakers can do. I think that organizations and communities can do that. And that can transform the way that our systems function pretty inherently.
Wow, Jesse, thank you so much. And I think that's the perfect ending to the formal part of the presentation where I had questions that I was asking for folks. But we will be here for another 15 minutes, ready to answer any and all questions that you have. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And while folks are thinking about what they want to ask or formulating your question, I will just throw out to the panelists, Hunger Games, pick who goes first. What is giving you hope right now about building a trauma-informed society?
I think what's giving me hope right now is it kind of goes to what Jesse was talking about with evidence-based practices. Like we have been very clear in this kind of academic space on ACEs, but kind of to what Jesse was talking about, that there's a clear who gets funded, who are the researchers, what do they look like, what are they focused on, is important. And so I think we have a clear trend in the movement of adopting Indigenous practices, even if we don't call them that. We have different wording for them, but their roots are Indigenous. So restorative practices and things of that nature, we're really getting back to this connection piece that now we're looking into what is the evidence behind this? What is the evidence behind Indigenous practices? And, the truth is that they work. Obviously, our ancestors knew that. And so we have to relearn it. And so I'm very inspired by the adoption of Indigenous practices as healing modalities or a part of the healing-centered work that is really then pushing against this narrative pushing against the narrative like scientific racism and scientific colonialism, which I think is important.
Thank you, Ingrid. I appreciate that. So no one's raised their hand yet. So our other three panelists, anybody want to take that? What's giving you hope right now?
I'm hopeful about it. Like I've probably known about this for maybe 5 years now. And then I could just tell by my own trajectory and the people that operate in my space and the people that I've been able to affect. So it makes me like, okay, like the more this gets spread, and especially from the perspective that I come from, because I don't feel like I feel like I'm the non-academic room all the time anyway. So I'm like, y'all know it won't work like that. It's not going to work like that because you don't understand the space. And I even had this conversation with Dr. Perry, to be honest with you. I'm like, look, man, the minute I say neurosequential model, I lose the room. I can't even say that. So like to say, especially the kids that I'm dealing with and knowing the things that they're going through and the things that's on their brains and in their minds before I can take a super academic approach. I actually know I can't take an academic approach. So I prefer to do it in a sports setting versus in a school setting because I have a little bit more space to have them run if they need to. And it's not a punishment. It's not a punitive process. It's I have the understanding that this physiological process will help you in your psychological process. Like I know that background. And so I feel like if coaches had a better understanding how the brain works, then they would deal with their athletes a little bit different. They wouldn't put them in a fight, flight, or freeze space right before they get ready to go shoot the game, win the free throws, because they have an understanding of how that works. And so my hope is, and plus athletes are very marketable and they're very influential in how things change. So the whole cannabis movement in like 5 to 10 years was, I think, spearheaded by athletes speaking out about it or having to go through suspensions and different things like that. So in a 10 to 20 year span, they've been able to just change how that has looked. And so I think the same thing will happen in the mental health space because it has happened through athlete involvement and advocacy by they're talking about some of their mental health practices or talking about some of their mental health issues and getting help with those things. I think that has brought a lot of this to the forefront as well. And so I just think that's my hope. My hope is, athletes get involved and they talk about it and they talk about how they were able to overcome different things. And sports was one of the things. But then when you can understand why through like, well, sports gave you this PACEs information, sports gave you these positive environments where they weren't actually available in other spaces. Sports gave you that. And so that's my hope. I'm like, and I love sports anyway, so I give myself an excuse to keep playing as long as I feel,
I love that, Martin. Thank you so much. And we do have a question from a participant. Just talking about, Ingrid, I'd love to start with you on this one, but equitable ways to bring healing tools to the communities that we serve and doing it sustainably. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this is really important. It really ties to kind of the work that I'm doing now in writing a book about how to really reduce stress in school, but not just for students, but also all the adults in the building too. But one of the things that I've been trying to incorporate in that book very intentionally is that, kind of getting to what Martin is saying, that we have to meet people where they are. And when we talk about healing, and first thing that comes to mind in the trauma-informed movement is, maybe yoga and mindfulness, but there are many different cultures within our society that need to be seen, and they need to see themselves in that healing work. And so even if we use like maternal infant health, there are so many indigenous African practices that would help mothers to be able to go through the birthing process in a healing way. Things that we're not even talking about. We're just now getting into this space where we're like, oh yes, midwives and doulas. Well, those are indigenous practices. And there's more than just that. We did a conference, Grief, not too long ago, probably about a little bit over a year ago. And we were able to talk about, we don't even know how to grieve as a country. We don't have processes in place. Indigenous peoples had processes for every aspect of being a human being, every aspect of being a human being. And we are not tapping into that. And so I think that this is one way that we can easily bring about healing in an equitable way. People, when you come in and you say, hey, brain science, you need to meditate, people are like, sure. That's missing so many people. We really need to do is think through how we can connect with people culturally. That is going to be what equity looks like. It's going to be popular education, and also radical inquiry, how we help people to see the systems that are impacting them. That's equity. Not everybody has the same types of systemic issues. So when we talk about issues, how are we making it so that people understand what are the systemic issues that are impacting you? This is especially important in schools, because when we don't do that, what we have is people who are, oppression and trauma and is just noise in the background. They don't even know what's happening to them or how they can even get to the point where they can bring it to their awareness to address it, to engage in healing. And so radical inquiry helps me to understand that when I look at my neighborhood and everybody in my neighborhood is brown like me, and everybody seems to be outside of the norm in society, be it poverty or violence or whatever it is. When I look on TV and I think about what happiness looks like or the books that I read, it doesn't reflect me. And it must be an issue of my skin color because this is what everybody looks like, or those kinds, or it must be an issue of my culture. They internalize it. In order for them to not internalize it, they have to be aware of the issues, not when they get to college, but when they're 3 to 5 years old, which is when they understand that there is some type of hierarchy out there, when they begin to compare themselves to others, and this feeds into their own sense of themselves. So we need to embrace starting young when it comes to addressing identity issues. We need to help parents to raise children in a way that aligns with positive identity development, especially racial and gender. And then we need to be able to embrace Indigenous practices so that we can combat, again, what scientific racism and colonialism looks like, which is this deficit view of communities of color, because we are not embracing our differences.
Oh, thank you so much, Ingrid.
I just want to piggyback on what she's saying. We went through the midwife thing with my son, and we had the doulas, and we kind of had a dual track because we still worked with the regular OBGYN, but the delivery process was midwife and doula. We could tell just how how worlds apart these systems were by going through this process. And I guess rightfully so, like we wanted to have such a natural thing, and it was perfect timing because of the pandemic. My son was born April 3rd, 2020. So like the lockdowns had just happened. I wouldn't have been able to been in the room through the traditional medical experience during that part of COVID. So I was able to experience the birth of my son in the living room with people who were doing Indigenous practices, understanding the whole birthing process. And we also understood what was going on in the traditional medical situation anyway, which was what prompted us to have a home birth in the first place. And I'm saying that to say that sometimes these Indigenous practices are just, they're deeply ran underground. And then there's that thing that could make it feel like this could be illegal, or this would turn around and make you a criminal of some kind of way of using the Indigenous practices that you do, or also being just illegitimized in your work. And also that has the economic effects to it too. So the people who are doing these Indigenous practices, the midwives, the doulas, that they're being taken care of, so they don't have to deal with their secondary trauma of going through the work that they do, just trying to get people through this whole birthing process in the first place. And again, I started with this as the topic because I think everything stems from that. Like this is where a new life happens and where the generational and the trauma passes in this moment. And so like, I think that is very, very just an important inflection point for this whole thing, because it's another generation of the trauma that goes unaddressed that we'll have to really, really take. We just need to look at this from a different perspective and a different lens. And so to be able to look at the Indigenous practices and be able to get that information and people where they can even find that type of information and be able to engage in those practices in addition to other things that are available, but that haven't shown that they have our best interests at heart from a systematic perspective is huge. So I just piggybacked on that because I think that's the point. I think that's the point of entry for me anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. And we are almost at the end of our time. So it's not going to be time for more questions. And I want to say thank you to our amazing panelists. I've learned so much, and I appreciate you taking the time. Jesse, Martin, Connie, Ingrid, thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you. So many of you stayed on. Almost everybody stayed on for the question period. So that's amazing. That is a testament to these fabulous panelists. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinski.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinski, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.